The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, while the fog still clung to the cobblestones of Marrowgate Lane and before the bells of St Albans had finished counting the hour. It came by private courier, not the common post, a detail the landlady would remember and repeat for years afterward, the way people do when they sense, too late, that they have witnessed the beginning of something. The seal was black wax, pressed with the crest of a falcon devouring a serpent. The Ashworth crest. A name that had not been spoken aloud in that narrow lodging house in almost 4 years. Miss Evelina Harcourt did not open it at once. She held it the way one holds a thing that might still, if left untouched, refuse to become real. Her hands, chapped from washing linens for other women's households, trembled faintly against the paper. Outside, a cartwheel groaned over ice. Somewhere below, a kettle whistled and was ignored. She had not expected to hear from Ashkam again. Not after the funeral. Not after the silence that followed it, a silence so complete it had felt, at times, like punishment. The Duke was dead. Her father had told her that much, 6 months prior, reading it from a newspaper column, with the flat, careful tone of a man delivering news he did not fully understand the weight of. Duke Reginald Ashworth, 9th of his line, dead at Ashkam Hall, leaving behind an estate whispered to be drowning in debt, an orchard long since gone to ruin, and, the papers had noted, almost as an afterthought. No acknowledged heir of direct blood. She had not thought of herself in that sentence. Why would she have? She was no one to the Ashworths. A dressmaker's daughter, once a governess in a lesser branch of a lesser family, dismissed under circumstances she did not like to recall. She had met the old Duke exactly twice in her life. Once as a child, in a hallway she was not meant to be in. Once as a young woman, in a library she had been sent to fetch a book from, and had instead been kept for nearly an hour by a tall, silver-haired man who asked her strange, searching questions about her mother. She broke the seal. The letter was brief, formal, signed by a solicitor's clerk in Lincoln's Inn, a Mr. Aldous Penrose, requesting, no, summoning Miss Evelina Harcourt to appear at the reading of the late Duke's final testament 3 days hence at Ashkam Hall. She read it 4 times before she understood what it did not say. It did not say why. Before we go further into what waited for her behind those gates, the orchard already whispered to be cursed, the debts no living Ashworth would speak of aloud, and the secret that would not surface until long after the first frost. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, take a moment now to press subscribe so you never miss where these old English houses lead. And do tell me in the comments in these first few minutes where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every one, and it means more than you know to see how far these quiet stories travel. Now back to Marrowgate Lane and to a letter that had already begun, without her knowing it, to rewrite the whole of her life. She did not yet understand what waited at Ashkam. She only knew that for the first time in 4 years, someone with the Ashworth name had remembered she existed. And in her narrow room, with the cartwheels still groaning outside and the kettle still shrieking below, Evelina Harcourt began, quietly, to be afraid of hope. To understand why the letter frightened her more than it comforted her, one must first understand what had already been taken from Evelina Harcourt, and how quietly, how completely, a life of comfort can be dismantled by other people's decisions. 4 years earlier, she had not been a laundress's assistant living above a chandler's shop. She had been Miss Harcourt of Trenwith House, daughter of a respected, if not wealthy, gentleman farmer whose family had held a small but proud estate in Somerset for 3 generations. Her mother had died when she was 12, of a fever that took half the village with her, and her father had never fully recovered from the grief, though he had tried, in his quiet way, to give his only daughter the education and bearing of a lady, even as their fortunes thinned. She had been raised on Latin and needlework, on long walks through orchards, not unlike the one that would one day bear her name upon its deed. On the certainty, however fragile, that she belonged somewhere. Then came the debts. Not her father's debts, precisely, though he bore them in the end. A cousin, trusted with the management of the family's modest investments, had gambled away what little security remained, and vanished across the channel before the truth was known. Trenwith House was sold within the year to settle what could not be forgiven. Her father, broken by the shame of it more than the poverty, took ill that winter and did not see the spring. Evelina was 21 when she buried him, with no dowry, no house, and no family willing to claim her. She did not weep in front of others. She had learned, in that year, that grief displayed was grief exploited, that relatives who had once praised her accomplishments now regarded her as a burden narrowly avoided, a cautionary tale to be discussed over tea and then quietly forgotten. She took work where she could find it. First as a governess to a family in Kent, until the lady of the house grew suspicious of her husband's lingering attentions and dismissed Evelina without reference, without explanation, and without the courage to admit the fault lay elsewhere. Then as a seamstress. Then, when her eyes grew too tired for fine needlework by candlelight. As a laundress, her once elegant hands submerged daily in water, gone grey with other people's dirt. She did not yet understand that the world she had lost was about to reach back for her. It would have been easy, in those years, to grow bitter. Many women in her position did, and no one could have blamed them for it. But there was something in Evelina Harcourt that refused to calcify into resentment. A quiet, stubborn patience her mother had once called her, orchard temperament, the ability to endure a hard winter without forgetting that spring was a law of nature, not a kindness. Still, the letter from Lincoln's Inn threatened that patience more than any hardship had. Because hope, she had learned, was more dangerous than despair. Despair asked nothing of you. Hope asked you to risk everything on the chance that this time the door would not be shut in your face. She wrote to Mr. Penrose accepting the summons. She sold the last of her mother's jewellery, a modest garnet brooch she had kept through every reduction of circumstance, to pay for the coach fare and a single presentable black dress. And on a grey Thursday morning, with fog still lying low over the fields, she boarded a coach bound for a corner of England she had never seen, toward an estate she did not yet know would become the whole of her future. She did not speak to the other passengers. She watched the hedgerows blur past the window and thought, with a kind of exhausted honesty, that whatever waited for her at Ashkam Hall could not possibly be worse than what she had already survived. She was not yet aware how wrong and how right that thought would prove to be. What waited was not simply a fortune, nor simply ruin. It was both, entangled so thoroughly that no one, not the solicitor, not the servants, not even the dead Duke himself, perhaps, could say with certainty which would win. Ashkam Hall did not announce itself gently. The coach turned off the main road some 2 hours after noon, down a long, rutted avenue lined with elms so old and so close together that they formed a kind of cathedral over the drive, their bare winter branches interlacing above like the ribs of some vast, sleeping creature. Evelina pressed her gloved hand to the cold glass of the window and watched the house emerge from the mist by degrees. First a chimney, then a gable, then the whole grey weight of it, stone the colour of old bone, with ivy creeping up one wing, as though the earth itself were trying, slowly, to reclaim what had been built upon it. Beyond the house, to the east, she glimpsed rows upon rows of trees, bare-limbed and crooked, stretching toward a low grey horizon. The famous orchard. Even from a distance, even in winter when all orchards look somewhat sorrowful, there was something particularly forlorn about it, trees planted in careful lines by hands long dead, now leaning at odd angles. Some clearly fallen and left to rot where they lay. She did not yet understand that she was looking at the very heart of the fortune and the ruin that had brought her here. The housekeeper who received her at the door was a narrow woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in unrelieved black, with the kind of composed, watchful face that gives away nothing by design rather than by nature. She introduced herself as Mrs. Bramwell, and her eyes moved over Evelina with a thoroughness that felt less like appraisal and more like recognition, as though she were confirming something she had already suspected. "You'll be wanting to rest before the reading, Mrs. Bramwell said, in a voice carefully arranged to reveal nothing. "The solicitor is expected at 4. "Thank you," Evelina said. And then, because the silence in the hall pressed upon her strangely, a silence too complete for a house of this size, too heavy for mere emptiness, she added, "Is the family in residence?" Something crossed the housekeeper's face. Gone before it could be named. "There is no family in residence, miss. Not any longer." No one in the house spoke of it further, and Evelina did not press. She would learn, in the days that followed, that this was the particular quality of Ashkam Hall, that questions asked directly were met with silence, while the truth revealed itself sideways, in glances exchanged too quickly, in rooms kept locked for no stated reason, in servants who lowered their voices the moment she entered a corridor. The reading of the will took place in the long library, a room of dark wood and taller shelves than Evelina had ever stood beneath, dust motes turning slowly in the grey afternoon light that filtered through tall windows streaked with the season's rain. Mr. Aldous Penrose was a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers and the permanently apologetic expression of one who has spent a career delivering news that pleases no one. There were 4 others present: a cousin of the late Duke's, one Lord Edmund Ashworth, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with the restless energy of someone accustomed to getting his way and unaccustomed to waiting rooms; his wife, Lady Cordelia, thin-lipped and watchful, who studied Evelina from the moment she entered with an intensity that bordered on hostility; an elderly aunt, Lady Prudence Vane, who dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief more from habit than genuine grief; and an old steward named Josiah Pruitt, who stood near the door as though uncertain he had the right to sit, and who watched Evelina with an expression she could not immediately place, until later, much later, she would recognize it as grief mingled with something like relief. Lord Edmund did not trouble to hide his impatience. "I confess I do not understand," he said, before Mr. Penrose had finished arranging his papers, "why a stranger has been invited to a family matter." "You will understand shortly, my lord," Penrose said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has read the document in question and knows precisely how unwelcome its contents will be. He read slowly. The bulk of the estate's remaining liquid assets, modest and heavily encumbered by debt, passed, as expected, to Lord Edmund, along with the title and the London townhouse. But the land itself, Ashkam Hall, its surrounding grounds, and specifically, named with unusual precision, the orchard and its adjoining cottage and outbuildings, passed in their entirety to Miss Evelina Harcourt. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock alone. It was the silence of people rapidly recalculating what they had believed to be true. "This is absurd," Lord Edmund said at last, his voice tight. "The girl is no relation. She cannot even claim acquaintance beyond—" "The late Duke's instructions were explicit, my lord," Penrose interrupted, not unkindly, but with the immovable calm of a man who had anticipated this exact outburst. "And I should note that the orchard, as bequeathed, comes with certain conditions attached, as well as certain debts. Substantial debts, incurred against the land itself, which Miss Harcourt will be required to satisfy within 12 months, or forfeit the property entirely to its creditors." Evelina, who had said almost nothing since entering the room, found her voice at last. "Why me?" Penrose's eyes flickered. just briefly. Toward the sealed envelope still resting on the table before him, a second letter, she would learn, meant for her alone, not to be opened in this room. "That, Miss Harcourt," he said carefully, "is a question His Grace chose to answer only to you." She did not yet understand that this single, unopened envelope contained the first thread of a truth that would unravel everything she believed about her own history. She only understood, in that moment, that she had been given an orchard already dying, debts she could not yet calculate, and the undisguised enmity of a man who had expected to inherit everything. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than a disappointed cousin's temper. It would take her weeks to understand that Lord Edmund's fury was not merely about money, though the debts were real and considerable, but about something buried far deeper in the orchard's soil, something the old Duke had spent the last years of his life trying, quietly, desperately, to set right. The private letter was not opened until that night, alone, by candlelight, in a bedchamber that smelled faintly of dust and old lavender, and had clearly not been slept in for years. The Duke's hand was shaky, the hand of a man near death, Evelina thought, though the letter itself gave no date. It began, without preamble. "If you are reading this, then I have run out of time to say what I ought to have said years ago, and I trust instead to paper what I could not bring myself to say to your face. I knew your mother, Evelina, before your father did. That is all I will commit to this page, for reasons that will become clear should you choose to look for them. The orchard is dying, because I let it die, out of grief I never permitted myself to name. Restore it, and you will find more than fruit among its roots." She read the letter 3 times, and each time understood less rather than more. Who had her mother been to this man? What grief? What roots? She did not sleep well that first night at Ashkam. The days that followed unfolded in careful, uneasy layers, the way frost forms on a window, invisible at first, then suddenly, undeniably there. Mrs. Bramwell, though correct in every particular of her duties, seemed to watch Evelina with a wariness that softened, almost imperceptibly, over the following week, as though testing whether she would prove worthy of some confidence not yet offered. Old Josiah Pruitt, the steward, lingered near the orchard gate more often than his duties strictly required, and twice Evelina caught him watching her from a distance with an expression she could only describe as hope. The orchard itself, walked at first light on her second morning, told its own quiet story of neglect. Rows of apple and pear trees, once clearly planted with great care and no small expense, stood tangled with bramble, their branches broken by winters no one had troubled to prune them against. And yet, she noticed this almost against her will. Beneath the ruin, the bones of the place were sound. The soil, when she knelt and pressed her bare fingers into it, was rich and dark, not exhausted, as failing land so often becomes, but merely abandoned. Someone had once loved this ground enough to plant it well. Someone had since decided it was easier to let it die than to face whatever memory it held. She did not yet understand that the orchard's decline had begun the same year her mother left Somerset for Trenwith House, the same year, in fact, that a young Evelina had been born. Lord Edmund did not leave quietly. He returned twice in her first fortnight, ostensibly to discuss the practical difficulties of the inheritance, though each visit felt less like negotiation and more like a slow, deliberate pressure applied to a bruise. He spoke of the debts, considerable, he reminded her, secured against the land itself, owed to a merchant bank in Bristol with little patience for sentiment. He spoke of the impossibility of a woman alone managing an estate. He suggested, more than once, that she would be wise to sell her interest in the orchard to him, quietly, before the year's deadline made the decision for her at a price far worse than any he now offered. "You do not understand what you have inherited," he told her once, on the gravel drive. His voice pitched low enough that no servant might overhear. "This place is not a gift, Miss Harcourt. It is a trap dressed in blossom." she did not yet understand how literally he meant it. It was Mrs. Bramwell who first mentioned, obliquely, that the old Duke had kept a private study in the East Wing, a room that had been locked since his death, its key held, she believed, only by Mr. Pruitt. It was mentioned almost carelessly, in the course of some unrelated errand, and Evelina noted the way the housekeeper's eyes flicked toward her afterward, as though gauging whether the seed had taken root. She found Josiah Pruitt in the orchard the following dusk, pruning a fallen branch with hands too old for the work, but too stubborn to stop. "The study," she said simply. "Will you show it to me?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, his breath fogging in the cold air. "His Grace asked me, before the end, to give you the key myself, when I judged the time was right." He studied her face in the fading light. "I believe the time has come, miss. The room, when at last she stood within it, was not what she expected. No grandeur, no ostentation, only a modest desk, shelves of ledgers and correspondence gone brittle with age, and, propped against the window, a portrait she had not been told existed. A young woman with dark hair and a familiar tilt to her chin, standing beneath the very orchard trees that now grew wild beyond the glass." Evelina did not need to be told whose face it was. She had seen it every morning of her childhood, in the small oval mirror above her mother's dressing table. She did not yet understand the full shape of what this portrait meant. She only understood, standing in that dust-thick room with candlelight trembling across her mother's painted face, that the orchard's decay and her own inheritance were not accidents of a dying man's whim, but the last act of a story that had begun long before she was born, and that the answer to why lay somewhere among the ledgers now gathering dust at her feet. She did not sleep that night either. She sat instead at the old Duke's desk, working through ledgers by candlelight until the wax pulled low and her eyes ached, piecing together, slowly, the way one reconstructs a shattered vase from scattered fragments, a history no one at Ashkam had been willing to speak aloud. The ledgers went back nearly 30 years. In the earliest of them, the handwriting was steadier, almost eager, records of an ambitious young duke expanding his orchards, corresponding with growers as far as Kent and Herefordshire about grafting techniques, ordering rare rootstock at considerable expense. Interleaved among the agricultural accounts, tucked without explanation between pages of expenditure, were letters, dozens of them, tied with faded ribbon, addressed to a woman named only, tenderly, as my dearest E. Evelina's hands went cold reading them, not from cold room air, but from the growing terrible certainty of what she was uncovering. Her mother's name had been Eleanor. The letters spoke of a love the Duke had never been permitted to acknowledge, a young woman of modest birth, a farmer's daughter he had met, by his own account, walking the very orchard rows he had planted with such devotion, back when the trees were young and the future unwritten. His family, he wrote in one particularly anguished letter, would never sanction such a match. A duke did not marry a girl who mended her own gowns. He had been sent, within the year, to make a suitable marriage elsewhere, a match arranged, loveless, and, as the ledgers later revealed, childless, which perhaps explained why no direct heir had ever been born to inherit Ashkam. But Eleanor, her mother, had already been carrying his child when he left. Evelina set the letter down with hands that would not quite stop trembling. She had always believed herself the daughter of the quiet, grieving gentleman farmer who had raised her at Trenwith House. And in every way that mattered, she told herself fiercely, she still was. He had loved her without condition, without ever once making her feel the burden of a truth he must, she now understood, with a fresh and painful clarity, have known from the very beginning. She did not yet understand why the old Duke had waited until death to acknowledge her, rather than providing for her openly, decades earlier, when such provision might have spared her family years of hardship. That answer, too, waited among the ledgers, though it would take her several more nights and considerably more courage to find it. What she found instead, first, was the reason the orchard had died. A later letter, dated some 20 years past, written in a hand grown heavier with grief, described the Duke's discovery that Eleanor had married, quietly, without his knowledge until after the fact, to a Somerset farmer who would raise her daughter as his own. The Duke had written of his devastation, not with anger, but with something closer to penance. "I have no right to grief I forfeited by my own cowardice," he had written. "But I find I cannot tend what we planted together, knowing I will never walk its rows with her again. Let it go wild, as I have let everything else that mattered go wild. It is no less than I deserve." From that year forward, the ledgers showed a steady, deliberate withdrawal of care from the orchard. Orders for grafting stock cancelled. Correspondence with growers ceased. Wages for orchard hands quietly reduced until only old Pruitt remained to watch the trees decline, out of loyalty rather than payment. The Duke had, in effect, let the orchard die as a kind of private mourning for a love and a daughter he had denied himself the right to claim. And the debts, those crushing, deliberately timed debts Lord Edmund now dangled over her future, were not, Evelina began to suspect, as she cross-referenced dates and figures long into that second sleepless night, entirely the Duke's doing it all. She found the proof 3 nights later, in a ledger nearly lost among a shelf of unrelated household accounts, its binding disguised to match the volumes surrounding it, a detail so deliberate it could only have been intentional. The loans secured against the orchard land, the very debts now threatening to strip her of her inheritance within the year, had been arranged not by the old Duke in some fit of aristocratic mismanagement, but by Lord Edmund himself, acting under a limited power of attorney granted during the Duke's final illness, a power, the ledger's careful annotations suggested, that had been exercised well beyond its intended scope, and possibly beyond its legal one. Debts incurred, timed with unsettling precision, to mature and come due within 12 months of the Duke's death. Debts designed, it seemed increasingly clear, not to fund the estate's needs, but to manufacture precisely the crisis that would force whoever inherited the orchard to sell it, cheaply, quickly, and to no one but Lord Edmund himself. She did not yet understand every mechanism of the scheme, but she understood enough to see its shape clearly. For the first time, Lord Edmund had known, or at least suspected, that the orchard would not pass to him. And rather than accept it, he had spent the Duke's final months quietly ensuring that whoever did inherit it would inherit ruin alongside it. Years later, the full truth would emerge in far greater detail than Evelina possessed that night. Testimony, correspondence, the eventual unravelling of Lord Edmund's arrangement with the Bristol Bank. But even by candlelight, even exhausted and grieving a father she had just discovered she'd never truly known, she understood enough to feel something harden inside her that had not been there before. Not bitterness, something closer to resolve. She would not sell the orchard. She would not let it finish dying, as a monument to 2 people's cowardice and 1 man's greed. She would save it, instead. The revelation did not arrive all at once to the rest of the household, nor did Evelina share it freely. She understood, with an instinct sharpened by years of watching how quickly sympathy could curdle into suspicion, that a woman claiming secret noble parentage invited scrutiny far more readily than belief. She kept the letters locked away, the portrait covered, and told no one beyond Mrs. Bramwell and old Pruitt, both of whom, she now realised, had known some version of the truth for years, and had waited, with a patience she found almost unbearably moving, for her to discover it herself rather than be told. His Grace made us swear it, Mrs. Bramwell admitted quietly, the evening Evelina finally confronted her. He said, "The truth should come to you through your own hands, or not at all." He did not think himself entitled to hand you a father you had never asked for. He was wrong, Evelina said, though not unkindly. I would have wanted to know sooner. Perhaps, the housekeeper allowed. But he was a man who had spent his whole life being told what he was entitled to, miss. In the end, I believe he was trying, in his own broken way, to leave you a choice he never gave himself. It was not forgiveness, exactly, that settled in Evelina after that conversation. But it was something adjacent to it, an understanding that grief and cowardice often wear the same quiet face, and that the dead cannot be made to answer for what they left undone, only for what they chose, at the very last, to attempt to repair. What remained, now, was Lord Edmund. She did not confront him with the ledger immediately. She understood, with the same patience that had carried her through 4 years of diminished circumstance, that an accusation without proof sufficient to withstand a courtroom would only give him time to destroy what evidence remained. Instead, she wrote, carefully, at length, into the night, to a solicitor of her own choosing in London, a Mr. Nathaniel Gray, recommended to her in a brief, unexpected note from Mr. Penrose himself, who had, she suspected, harboured his own quiet doubts about the timing of those debts from the very first reading of the will. While the wheels of that inquiry turned slowly in London, Evelina turned her attention to the orchard itself. She did not yet understand how to prune a neglected tree, how to judge healthy rootstock from diseased, how to read the particular grey of a branch that meant only surface damage against the grey that meant the wood beneath had already died. But she was not entirely without resource. Among the old Duke's papers she found, carefully preserved, the very correspondence he had once kept with growers in Kent and Herefordshire, decades-old letters describing grafting techniques, soil treatments, the particular patience required to coax life back into abandoned rootstock. It was, she realised with a quiet ache, a kind of second inheritance, not merely land, but knowledge, left behind by a man who had perhaps hoped, even as he let the orchard fall to ruin, that someone might one day use his own careful notes to undo the damage his grief had caused. Old Pruitt became, in those weeks, both her teacher and her staunchest ally. He had tended what remained of the orchard alone for years, out of loyalty to a duke who paid him little and asked less. And he possessed in his weathered hands a practical wisdom no ledger could contain. Together, through the bitter tail end of winter, they began the slow work of restoration, clearing bramble, pruning dead wood, grafting new growth onto rootstock old Pruitt swore was sound beneath its ruined bark. It was hard, cold, humbling work, and more than once Evelina found herself weeping quietly among the trees, from exhaustion or grief or some combination the winter light made impossible to distinguish. But she did not stop. Word of her efforts reached the village before spring did. At first with skepticism, what did a laundress's daughter, however unexpectedly titled to the land, know of orchards? And then, as the pruned rows began to show the first tentative signs of health, with a cautious, gathering respect. Local farmhands who had watched Ashcombe's orchard rot for a decade began, quietly at first, then more openly, offering their labour in exchange for a share of whatever the first harvest might bring. It was, Evelina understood, both an act of genuine goodwill and a calculated wager, but she welcomed it regardless, for she desperately needed the hands, and the trust, however conditional, mattered to her more than she could easily admit. Lord Edmund did not remain idle while the orchard slowly returned to life. He returned to Ashkam twice more that spring, his patience visibly fraying. His offers to purchase her interest growing first more generous, then more threatening, as the 12-month deadline drew nearer and it became clear she had no intention of selling. On his final visit, standing once more upon the gravel drive, he abandoned pretense entirely. "You cannot save this land in a single season," he said, "however many farmhands you charm into pity. The debt comes due whether the trees bloom or not, Miss Harcourt. And when it does, I will have this orchard for a fraction of its worth, and you will have nothing but the satisfaction of having tried. She did not yet understand, standing there in the cold spring wind, that his confidence concealed a growing desperation of his own. That Mr. Gray's quiet inquiries in London had already begun to unsettle the Bristol Bank's willingness to enforce debts that increasingly appeared, on closer examination, to have been fraudulently timed and improperly secured. Nor did she know that Lord Edmund's own finances, strained by gambling debts of his own long concealed from his wife, made the orchard's swift and cheap acquisition not merely a matter of ambition, but of increasingly urgent necessity. She only knew, watching his carriage disappear down the elm-lined drive, that she would not yield the ground her mother had once walked, nor the trees her father, for she had come, slowly, to think of the old Duke that way, however imperfectly he had earned the title. Had planted with a love he never permitted himself to keep. The first blossoms came in April, tentative and white against branches that had, only months before, seemed beyond saving. The truth, when it finally surfaced in full, did so not through confrontation, but through the quiet, relentless mechanism of law that Evelina had set patiently in motion months before, a mechanism Lord Edmund had gravely underestimated, perhaps because he had never imagined the laundress's daughter capable of matching him at his own game of careful, documented patience. Mr. Nathaniel Gray's inquiries in London had, by early summer, produced exactly what the hidden ledger promised. Correspondence between Lord Edmund and the Bristol Bank predating the Duke's death by several months. Arrangements for loans secured against Ashkam's orchard land that bore, on close legal scrutiny, no valid authorization from the Duke himself, only Lord Edmund's signature. Exercised under a power of attorney whose terms explicitly excluded the encumbrance of entailed land without the Duke's direct written consent. Consent that had never been given because, as Mr. Gray's inquiry eventually established beyond serious dispute, the Duke had been too gravely ill in his final months to have given it knowingly at all. It was, in the precise and bloodless language of the law, fraud, committed by a man who had gambled that a dying Duke's confusion and a stranger's unfamiliarity with estate law would keep his scheme from ever facing daylight. He had not reckoned on Josiah Pruitt's decades of quiet, careful record-keeping. He had not reckoned on Mrs. Bramwell's long, patient loyalty to a truth she had waited years to see honoured. And he had not reckoned on Evelina Harcourt, who had survived 4 years of diminished circumstance by learning, above all else, the particular patience required to wait for the right moment to act. The confrontation, when it came, took place not in the Grand Library, where the will had first been read, but in the orchard itself, beneath trees now heavy with the season's first true blossom, a detail Evelina had arranged quite deliberately, for she wanted Lord Edmund to stand upon the very ground his scheme had been designed to steal, and see it, for the first time in years, alive. Mr. Gray read the findings aloud, calmly, methodically, while Lord Edmund's face moved through disbelief, fury. And finally, as the specific dates and figures accumulated into an irrefutable pattern, something closer to defeat. Lady Cordelia, standing some distance apart, said nothing at all, though her expression suggested this was not, perhaps, entirely a surprise to her. "The bank has already been informed," Mr. Gray said, in conclusion, "that the debts in question were improperly secured, and are therefore void. Miss Harcourt's inheritance stands unencumbered. I need not remind you, my lord, what the further pursuit of this matter through the courts would mean for your own standing, nor, I suspect, for certain other debts of your own the bank has become rather curious about in the course of this inquiry." Lord Edmund did not speak for a long moment. When at last he did, his voice had lost the commanding edge it had carried on every previous visit. "You understand nothing of what it is," he said quietly, almost to himself, to watch a title and a fortune you believed your birthright pass, instead to a stranger. She is not a stranger, Mrs. Bramwell said, from where she stood near the orchard gate, her voice carrying more authority than Evelina had ever heard her use before. She is his daughter, my lord, whatever the law may or may not have recognized. And she has done more for this land in half a year than this family managed in the last 20. It was, Evelina thought later, the closest thing to a eulogy the old Duke would ever receive, spoken not in a church, but among the trees he had planted for a love he had been too afraid to keep, delivered by a housekeeper who had guarded his secrets faithfully for decades, in defence of the daughter he had left, at the very end, everything he had left to give. Lord Edmund departed Ashkam that afternoon and did not return. The scandal, when it eventually reached London drawing rooms, was managed quietly. As such scandals among the aristocracy so often were, a confidential settlement, a discreet withdrawal from society for a season, the sort of punishment that satisfied the law without ever quite becoming public spectacle. It was not, Evelina reflected, true justice in the fullest sense, but it was enough. The orchard was hers, free and clear, and the truth of who had tried to steal it and why no longer needed to hide in ledgers disguised to look like household accounts. What she had not expected, in the relief that followed, was how much lighter the truth of her own parentage felt once it no longer needed to remain a secret weapon held in reserve against Lord Edmund's schemes. She found she could speak of the old Duke, gradually, without the strange, guarded caution she had maintained for months, could visit the portrait in the East Wing study without her chest tightening, could walk the orchard rows and feel, at last, that she walked them as herself, rather than as a claim to be defended. She did not yet understand how completely the orchard's first true harvest would come to answer every doubt that scandal, debt, and betrayal had left behind. That answer was still months away, ripening slowly on branches that had, not so very long ago, seemed beyond any hope of bearing fruit at all. Autumn came to Ashkam gently that year, as though the land itself understood what was owed to it after so long a winter of neglect. The harvest, when it arrived, was not merely good. It was, by the account of every farmhand and grower who had doubted her the previous spring, the finest the orchard had produced in over 2 decades, rows of apples heavy and red against branches that had, within living memory, seemed fit only for firewood. Old Pruitt wept, quite without shame, the first morning he walked the rows and saw what patience and proper care had restored. He told Evelina, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely permitted himself, that he had not believed he would live to see the orchard bare like this again, and that he had kept faith only because the old Duke, in his final year, had asked him to trust that someone would come who could finish what grief had left undone. The village that had watched with cautious skepticism now arrived in genuine numbers to help with the gathering, and what had begun, for some, as a calculated wager on an uncertain outcome had become, by the harvest's end, something closer to shared pride. Ashcombe's orchard, once a local byword for ruin and aristocratic neglect, was, within a single season, spoken of instead as a kind of quiet local marvel, the estate the laundress's daughter had brought back from the dead. The proceeds of that first harvest, modest as they were against the scale of the debts that had once threatened to consume the estate entirely, proved more than sufficient once those fraudulent debts had been struck from the ledger. What remained, invested carefully under the sound guidance of Mr. Gray, gave Evelina, for the first time since Trenwith House had been sold from beneath her family, something she had not dared to expect again, security that did not depend on anyone else's goodwill. She restored the East Wing study first, once the practical matters of the estate were settled, not as a shrine, but as a room to be used again, its shelves reorganized, Its portrait of her mother hung, at last, in honest daylight rather than dust-covered shadow, in the main gallery beside a smaller, newly commissioned portrait of the old Duke himself. Painted from memory by an artist old Pruitt had recommended, who had known his grace in his younger, happier years. She did not pretend, in commissioning it, that the man had been faultless. But she found she wanted his memory to hang somewhere honest, neither villain nor saint, but simply a man who had loved imperfectly, feared greatly, and tried, however late, to make some part of it right. Mrs. Bramwell remained at Ashkam as housekeeper, though the wary distance she had maintained through Evelina's first uncertain weeks had long since softened into something like genuine affection, the particular, undemonstrative loyalty of a woman who had waited years to see the household she served find its rightful mistress at last. Old Pruitt, too old now for the heaviest labour, remained as orchard steward in name and honoured elder in practice, training the younger hands the estate could now properly afford to employ. Evelina did not marry that year, nor the year after, though there would, in time, be a quiet, steady gentleman farmer from the neighbouring parish who understood, better than most men of his standing, what it meant to love land that had once been broken and made whole again through patient work rather than inherited privilege. That, however, is a story for another telling. What mattered, in the autumn of that first harvest, was simpler and larger than any romance. Evelina Hartcourt, who had arrived at Ashcombe Hall a stranger with nothing but a black morning dress and a letter she did not understand, stood at last among rows of trees heavy with fruit that her own hands and her own stubborn, patient faith had helped restore to life. She had lost, in the space of a few short years, a home, a father, a name she believed entirely her own. She had gained, in their place, a truer understanding of who she had always been, not merely the daughter of a duke's late, guilty conscience, nor merely the daughter of the quiet farmer who had raised her with unconditional love, but a woman who had proven, through hardship no inheritance could have spared her, that she needed no title at all to be worthy of the ground she now called home. The orchard would bear fruit every autumn after that, for many years to come, and the story of the dying trees and the debts and the letter that arrived on a fog-bound Tuesday morning would be told, eventually, throughout the county, sometimes with embellishment, sometimes with the particular reverence people reserve for stories that feel, in some quiet way, like proof that patience is rewarded and that love, however late or however buried, finds its way eventually into the light. A story preserved, in the end, in the quiet memory of an old English estate and in the rows of an orchard that had once been left to die, and chose, instead, beneath the patient hands of a woman the world had underestimated, to live.